5 brands of cold press paper you should try. Are you exploring different watercolor papers but you have no idea where to start? Well, in this video, I'm going to demo 5 brands of 140-pound cold press paper. These are all readily available at Blick, which is how I got mine, or you can probably find them at your favorite art supply store. And I'm going to go through these papers in order of cheapest to most expensive. Before we get into it, just some quick thoughts on paper in general. Underestimating the importance of paper. Paper quality is one of those things I've really underestimated when working with new watercolor students. I'll recommend affordable options or let students use whatever paper they've brought because they spent the money on it or someone gifted it to them. But when students paint on paper they happen to have, it often just doesn't hold up in a way that allows them to experiment. It may even cause feelings of self-doubt, or worse, it causes them to give up, thinking it's their skills that are failing them. If I could do things all over again, I would emphasize the quality of the paper that students should start out with. I definitely noticed an improvement in my own painting once I started using 100% cotton paper. But even cheaper quality paper has their benefits, which is the next quick topic. Papers have specific uses. The paper you need can depend on the project. For example, cold press paper with more tooth or bumps adds texture to the painting, and it can also withstand heavier washes. But bumpier paper is also difficult to do fine line work on. It's also harder to scan without seeing the raised texture. Hot press paper, which is smoother, is better for line work and images where precise detail is paramount. Experimenting with different papers helps you figure out what you like, but it also can make certain goals easier. What you don't need. 140-pound paper is good enough. You don't need heavier than that to start. Of course, you should go out and try 300-pound paper if you can afford it. For me, moving beyond that felt more like an investment, and honestly, it wasn't until a custom artwork client of mine recently said they absolutely did not want any warping or buckling of the paper, and then I took the plunge to get a couple of full sheets of 300-pound paper. And recently I've been enjoying 300-pound paper in the Luchetti sketchbooks that I've featured in several videos. For me, the convenience of being able to work on thick paper in a portable sketchbook format was worth the expense. But in general, I don't recommend 300-pound paper for just starting out because it makes your experiments and mistakes very expensive. I don't think that's a great use of your money, and it's definitely not necessary in order for a painting to be sellable. Every single painting I've sold, except for that one commission, has been on 140-pound paper. Ultimately, you have to strike a balance between quality and disposability because if you're like me, you're not going to like all of your works and you're not going to keep all of them, but it's up to you what you're willing to budget for, especially for paper that may or may not become scrap paper in the end. Paper formats. One last thought before we move on to the brand comparisons is about paper formats. You can get a large single sheet, which is 22 by 30 inches, and then you can cut it into quarter pieces like this. Here I've actually torn the paper into 4 quarters and left a nice deckled edge. A pad is where the paper is bound on one side with glue or it's wire bound, and you can just paint on the paper and then tear it out when you're done. The downside with this is that if you use a lot of water, then it will actually warp or buckle unless you actually tear it out first and then tape it down to a surface. That way you can prevent the buckling. And then you can get a watercolor block, which is usually more expensive, but basically the whole stack of paper is glued together and there's one opening where it's not glued. When you're done painting, you can basically slide a knife into this area and carefully slice off that page. The downside of the block, besides being usually more expensive than a pad of paper, is that if you want to keep painting after you finished one, you have to wait until it completely dries before you can tear it off. And finally, we have the paper roll. This one is 44 inches wide. It's the biggest upfront investment, but it offers the biggest cost savings per square foot. You can cut it up to whatever size you need, but because it's rolled up, it takes more effort and patience to unroll it and prepare it. Usually I like to unroll it onto the floor. I cut the paper off that I need and I'll wet both sides. And then once it's almost completely dry, I will actually tape down all 4 edges onto the surface. And then when it completely dries, then it will be flat like a new sheet of paper. Okay, I've just shared about underestimating the importance of paper, the purpose of different papers, sticking with 140-pound paper for most applications in the different paper formats. There's still another key characteristic of watercolor paper that I'll talk about in a bit. But first, let's get into the brand comparisons. First up, we have Fabriano 1264. This is a pad. It's about 30 cents per sheet. It's a wood pulp. They say it contains bright white acid-free paper that responds beautifully to all wet media techniques, including watercolor, gouache, acrylic, and acrylic ink. They say it's ideal for artists of all levels, students, and professional artists. Number 2 is Canson XL. This is also a pad. It's about 34 cents per sheet. It's wood pulp. They say that this student quality paper is ideal for a variety of watercolor and mixed media techniques. Number 3 is fluid watercolor paper. It's also wood pulp. It's about 66 cents per sheet. They say this archival quality acid-free paper has the look, feel, and performance of 100% cotton, as well as a subtle tooth texture. Now, before we get to number 4 and 5, just a quick word about paper types. We have wood pulp and 100% cotton. Wood pulp cellulose is a wood fiber which is cheaper to manufacture, but it also doesn't absorb water as fast as cotton. It also yellows and degrades faster than cotton. Watercolor paint will sit on the surface and it will also dry faster. Because it sits on top, you can actually lift the paint easier, but it could cause the paper to pill or tear up if you're not careful. It's just not as strong as cotton. With 100% cotton paper, water gets absorbed better into its fibers and so it stays wet longer, which means you have more time to work with it, like when doing wet on wet washes or blending colors. Moving on to paper 4. Number 4 is Strathmore 400 series. This is 66 cents per sheet. It's also wood pulp. They say this acid-free cold pressed professional paper is perfect for lifting and scraping applications. It's popular with watercolors because of the fine and even washes that can be achieved. That's according to Strathmore. Number 5 is Arches. This is 100% cotton. It's about $1.37 per sheet. Sorry, that's the price for a pad. The price for a watercolor block is actually $2.45. According to Arches, the naturally white acid-free sheets are sized with natural gelatin that penetrates to their core, providing outstanding absorbency and a consistent texture. I've used all of these papers in my practice paintings and even real finished paintings that I've sold, but Arches is the main one that I've used that is 100% cotton. You'll see lots of people recommending them, and I would recommend it too, but there are other brands, including the ones I've mentioned so far, that have premium cotton paper too. I just haven't used them as much. And there isn't a huge price difference at that level between those brands, so maybe I'll do another comparison for another video, but Arches is really the one I've stuck with for the premium cotton paper. Now let's see how they actually hold up in practice. I'll try to demonstrate as clearly as possible what you can expect from these papers and how they hold up to a few techniques that I'll try. If you've learned something new so far, please give this video a thumbs up. And if you learned 2 or more things by the end of this video, would you consider subscribing to show your support? Thank you so much. All right, let's keep going. So I've laid out all 5 brands of watercolor paper and I've labeled them so we can keep track of which ones I'm working on. And basically I'm going to try a couple of techniques, wet on dry and wet on wet, on each paper. And you can see that I've drawn some squares to help us have some guidelines and just to maintain some consistency across these papers. It may be a little bit difficult to see. These papers have different levels of tooth or bumpiness. This Strathmore paper and the Canson paper, they seem to be the smoothest, and you can tell by the writing that it was easiest to write onto these papers. And then the Fabriano, it actually is pretty toothy. You can see my writing was a lot more jagged. And same with the fluid paper, the tooth is pretty large. And then the most tooth was found in the Arches paper. So you can see how bumpy it is. So again, watercolor papers, they have different uses. And even within the more affordable range of papers, you're going to find some differences. And we're not here to say that any of these are bad and you should not use them. All papers have their utility, but we can see that some of these papers, when you compare them against each other, they actually present rougher surfaces, and that can give you different results. So first I'm going to grab some ultramarine blue, and this is going to be a wet on dry technique. Now this paint definitely sits on top of the paper. Now I'm going to do wet on wet. And this is the relatively smooth, less bumpy Strathmore paper. So you might see a difference in how the paint goes on. This is the Canson paper. I'm going to apply wet on dry. You can see my brush is pretty wet. And I'm going to do wet on wet now. And now we're going to do the Fabriano, wet on dry. Already you can see the texture shows through the paint so much more readily here. This is the paper that has more tooth. It's bumpier, and then we're gonna do the wet on wet. This water is really staying on top of the paper. Next, we're gonna go to the fluid paper, wet on dry, wet on wet. And then finally, we're gonna do the arches paper, wet on dry. Now see how that immediately starts soaking into the paper. And already I can see how smoothly it goes on compared to some of the other papers here. You can still see my brush strokes in those other papers. You can see on the arches paper that even though I've gone over it a few times with the brush, they've actually blended together very well. Now I'm gonna finish arches by doing wet on wet. The water is soaking in, it's not staying on top, and it's definitely a silkier feeling here. And I've used largely the same brush strokes. I've gone horizontally, I've gone vertically, and you can already start to see some differences here. You see how the water in the Fabriano, it has pooled up down at the bottom. And again, my table is slanted, it's on an incline, so we're gonna see the water behave like that if the water's sitting on top of the paper. There's the Canson paper, Strathmore, the fluid, and we're gonna let this dry and come back and continue our testing here. So it's now been about 40 minutes since I actually finished painting these squares on all of our 5 paper brands. The Strathmore paper, the paint dried in a pretty smooth way. The paper is one of the smoother ones that we have here. Let's see the Canson paper. The wet on wet square, we can see this bloom taking place here, which didn't happen in the arches. It did happen in some of the other ones. And then we have the Fabriano here. We can see that the texture of the paper really shows through. It's not very pretty in terms of how it dried. The water pooled up towards the bottom here on the wet on wet square. The wet on dry square actually doesn't look that bad. On the fluid paper, we see the blooming happening here and the water, it's just dried unevenly. Then we have the arches paper, which I think dried in the best way possible. The wet on wet, it looks pretty consistent. The wet on dry is probably the most even and consistent of all of the papers. The squares ended up the best on the arches paper. However, in terms of the other 4 brands, they all performed in a different way from each other. This is where it's not easy to just label each of these papers as better than the other. They all have different uses. So keep that in mind as you shop for your paper. If you wanted paper that has more of a texture to it, where you can see some of the bumps, the tooth of the paper in your final painting, then you would go for one like the Fabriano. Maybe you don't like that look, then you might go for a smoother paper like the Canson or the Strathmore. But I think it's apparent how 100% cotton holds up under these 2 specific techniques. And just keep that in mind. So now it's about 3 hours after I've painted these squares, and I'm going to apply some lifting technique here. I'm just gonna brush through here and try to lift off a layer, and I'm wiping it off each time. It's important to wipe the color off the bristles after each 1 or 2 strokes, so you're not just wiping it back onto the paper. So that's lifted pretty nicely. No issues there. I'm going to try it in the wet on wet section, and I would say that lifted out pretty well too. I'm going to work on the Canson paper. I'm doing this one-handed here. Now, if this paper was a much thinner, lighter paper, less than 140 pounds, then it probably wouldn't stand up to this repeated lifting, and we might see some pilling of the paper, but this seems to be holding up just fine. It does help for the brush to be semi-moist so that you can actually reactivate the pigment, and that will allow us to actually lift it off better. Let's try the wet on wet square. Now, it is a common characteristic of wood pulp paper that because the pigment is not soaking in very deep, it's actually sitting closer to the surface, so it's easier to reactivate and lift off the paper. The downside is that the paper could be weaker. The fibers are not as strong as cotton, so we might actually end up seeing some pilling of the paper if the paper is not strong enough. That seems to be working just fine. And now let's go with the fluid paper. Let's see how this square down here fares. These 4 wood pulp brands are holding up just fine to the lifting technique. And let's go to the arches paper. Now, as expected, because cotton is more absorbent, the pigment is going to go deeper into the paper, and it requires a little bit more work to actually lift the pigment off, but you can see that it's working fine. And let's try in the wet on wet square, and actually reactivating that area that I'm trying to lift works really well. The paper is able to withstand repeated strokes. None of the papers really seem to present a problem in terms of the lifting technique. Next, I'm going to try re-wetting the edge of one of these squares to try to soften the edge and blend it into the dry part of the paper. So I'm coaxing the paint to the right, and we'll let that sit, and I'm going to do that on the Canson paper. And you can see how the pigment here just really easily started to flow outwards. Didn't take much work at all, but you can see that it's almost too easy to reactivate and pull away. It's leaving kind of a line there. Now I'm going to try the Fabriano. It's pretty easy to coax the paint away. And now we're going to do the fluid paper. Also very easy to make the paint move again. And now I'm going to try it on the arches. It does come out, not as quickly, it's not as flowy as the other papers. Now I'm going to exaggerate a little bit and go further in. You can see it's still blending pretty nicely. Here is the Strathmore, here's the Canson, the Fabriano, the fluid, and the arches. Not a really perceptible difference, but you can definitely see how the pigment on these two papers just really easily reactivated and flowed towards my brush. So that's a look at how several of these techniques might look different on these different brands of paper. Again, it's probably not a huge difference. It could be up to your own personal preference. As you saw, a quick test of all these papers can show us some of their benefits and limitations. I think it's good to familiarize yourself with these different types of paper, not only for your budget, but also so you can be flexible in whatever circumstances you might have. Like when you're traveling and you don't have access to the paper that you want at the moment, but you get the itch to paint a pretty scene, or you just want to have some paper around that can get you through a period of experimentation. And disposability is a really important factor, I think, because it will also help you get over any self-consciousness you might have with using watercolor paper and wasting it. So these are the 5 papers that I'm most familiar with. Now that you've witnessed some of their good and bad qualities, I'll let you take it from here. As usual, if you have any questions, drop them in the comments and I'll respond. If you're new to watercolor painting, I've put together a 1-page chart of essential supplies to consider when getting started. Check out the link in the description to download it for free. I'm Francis Shui, a working artist based here in New York City. If you enjoyed this, would you please like, share, and subscribe to show your support? And from here, you can check out my last video, which was all about watercolor tube paints. Until the next time, go and paint.